Okay.
Okay, good. So can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so already on the call now. Okay. Right. So here we go. Okay, so thank you for joining us for an impromptu conversation about the risk management plan for the project plan, risk and issue management. Next slide.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Okay. All right, good. So I want to talk a little bit about the risk management because that seemed to give a lot of people some trouble. So let me just zoom out and look at the big picture here. So the purpose of the risk management plan is really to help you be able to manage risk deliberately and consistently in your project. And in order to do that, you need to think about how you're going to approach risks before you're in the middle of a risk storm. What you don't want is to be in the project and have a bunch of events or risk events show up and then have an argument with people about, well, is this a high risk or a medium? How do I know which ones to prioritize? And, you know, how do we rate probability? And what is a big cost impact? Or what's a low schedule impact versus a medium schedule impact? You want to think about all those things up front so you aren't trying to deal with them when you're in crisis mode dealing with a risk. So that's why we take the time up front to say, okay, what are people's roles and responsibilities for risk management? Who has what authority with regards to risk? What categories of risks are there? Where are the big sources of risk? And those kind of things we want to think about up front. So when we're in the midst of a project and we're going through risk, it's almost like it's just something we do. It's, if you will, it's operationalized to go through the risk management. It's not a big deal. So part of what's in the risk management plan is developing descriptions for how you evaluate probability of something happening, and then evaluating or developing descriptions for each project objective. And so for the Greenleaf Farm, we've defined the objectives as cost, schedule, scope, or scope/quality, and then stakeholder satisfaction or stakeholder use. So we're going to develop descriptions for the impact to each of those objectives. And then we're going to say which combination of probability and impact is a low risk, which combinations are a medium risk, and which are high. So we'll do those things, and then also along the way we're going to talk about what's the purpose of a risk breakdown structure and how do you develop one. So that's what I'm going to go over in this webinar. Okay, next slide. Paula, next slide. Very good. Okay, so so to do this, we're going to do a risk management plan. We'll talk about a risk breakdown structure, and we'll structure our probability and impact matrix. Next slide. All right. So just some foundational things. If you have a relatively unimportant project, i.e., it's something just internal to your division and you're doing it as you can, you should not spend huge amounts of time and money dealing with risk management. Whereas if you have a bet the company on it or a very critical project and it's worth, you know, a multi-million-dollar project, 15 million, 25 million, some of the very large system engineering projects and construction projects even go into the hundreds of millions. Those risk management plan to be detailed. You want it to be robust because it should be consistent with the degree of uncertainty and with the degree of the criticality of the project. And when you start this, it's very early in the project. So when you're developing a charter, you're already looking to see what are the areas of risk, what are those areas of uncertainty that are going to hit my project I need to think about. And you need to plan early for risk management. And planning early means I'm putting time in to deal with risk management on a consistent basis, whether it's monthly or weekly or every quarter or phase I'm going to reevaluate. I'm making sure I've got the time and resources and the money to allocate for good risk management, because risk management is hard, and it's hard because we can't define uncertainty. It's hard to think about what are the things that could happen. It's hard enough to stay on top of a project without worrying about what could go wrong. But just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. In fact, it means it's critical that you do it, because once that risk event occurs, you no longer have the option to be able to mitigate it or transfer it to someone else or avoid it. You have got to deal with it, and then it's an issue, and you don't have any other options. So that's why we talk about risk management starting early and continuing throughout the entire project. It's not just a one-time thing. All right, next slide. Excellent. So very early in the project, you'll have, oh, I'm sorry, could you go back one to the contents? Yeah, perfect. So very early in the project, you'll develop a plan for how to deal with risk. And that'll be based on, like I said, on the criticality of the project, the size, the complexity, maybe if there's any one objective that's very tight, like a tight schedule or a fixed budget, you'll want to focus on that. So you'll look at roles and responsibilities, categories, then how often we're going to do risk management activities, and then this concept of risk appetite. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because that's kind of an interesting concept, and I didn't ask you guys to fill that out as part of your risk management plan, but I want to make sure we talk about that. And then your definitions of probability and impact and how they integrate on the matrix, and then we'll talk a little bit about, we probably won't talk about risk management funding and contingency or risk monitoring here, because those are covered in future classes. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. All right, so first thing, document roles and responsibilities for various risk management activities. On the sample risk management plan I gave as an assignment, you could see that there's roles for the team lead, you could see that there's roles for the project manager, you could see the roles for the sponsor and what their roles and responsibilities are. And it's good to document those up front, just because this is really a communication tool, so people know what's expected of them. When we talk about risk categories, what you're looking for is, what are the sources, the potential sources of risk? Like there's a bunch of risks associated with vendors, or there's a bucket of risks associated with the city. So we want to look at what are those big categories. And then I mentioned frequency and timing, like how often do we do risk management? And then risk appetite talks about the threshold of the organization and the stakeholders with regards to each objective. And when I say threshold, what I mean is a threshold is that point at which you take action. So for instance, if I say my threshold for the budget objective is 10%, that means if I have anything that's going to go over 10%, I'm going to take action. So if I have something that's going to be over budget by 4%, I don't take action. But if it goes over by 10%, that is my threshold for taking action. And the tighter the threshold, the less of an appetite you have for risk. So a threshold that says I take action at 5% of the budget, or a straight dollar amount, anything that's going to have an impact of over $5,000, I take action at. That person has less of a risk appetite, or another way I might say that is more risk averse than somebody who says my threshold is $10,000. So you need to find out the appetite that people have for uncertainty on the project for each objective. And so on the risk management plan, rather than giving a straight answer, I described to you how the key stakeholders felt about things, like we have to open up on time. What that tells you is there's very little risk appetite for a schedule slip. But what it did say is, hey, the farm school is important, getting the pea patches are important, but if the dog park doesn't open up on time, so there's a greater risk appetite for uncertainty associated with some of the things like the dog park, which don't bring in revenue, versus a short growing season where you need that farm school, you need those pea patches available, because if they start too late, then you've lost the whole season. So there's a shorter risk appetite, or less of a risk appetite, for that kind of schedule conflict. Okay, next slide. Okay. So let's talk about these risk categories. A risk breakdown structure, the definition is it's a hierarchical representation of potential sources of risks. So you might say technical is one area, like if you were working on an IT project, technical risks is one area, but that's a huge bucket. So it's not really useful to say, oh, well, I've got like 50 technical risks. Well, let's break it down into smaller, more bite-sized chunks. I've got technical risks associated with requirements. I've got technical risks associated with software. I've got technical risks associated with integration. I've got technical risks associated with cybersecurity. So these are, and none of those is a risk in and of itself. I have not named a risk. What I've said is these are potential sources of risks. Later on, I'll take a dive and I'll identify individual risk events based on that. But for, and again, for a small project, don't worry about it. But for a large project, you want to be able to say, what are the potential categories? Because that helps you to identify the individual risks. For instance, if we look at the Greenleaf Farm and I say, okay, you know what, on this project, you've probably got 50 to 100 risks. You say, oh my gosh, where do I start? Risk 1. Gee, we could go over our budget. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. I can't really do anything with that. So we need to start to break it into chunks so we can wrap our head around it. So if I say there's a risk there's a risk pool or a category called vendors, and then one of the vendors is associated with the equipment vendor. Okay, now I can say, okay, what are individual risks associated with the equipment vendor? Oh, well, the equipment may not be available, or the equipment may not be the right equipment that we want, or there may be an equipment breakdown, which could cause a schedule delay. Those are 3 individual risk events that I've just named, but I might not have thought of that unless I could break down and look at the categories. So that category helps me to generate a list of risks in our next step, which you're reading about this week. Okay, good. So next slide. Okay, so you can see here is a sample risk breakdown structure, and this is very generic. This is not necessarily about the Greenleaf Farm. It's just a generic way that you could break down stakeholders for any project. Like you could say my sponsor is one, senior management was one, team members, customers, the public. Each project will create one that represents their project environment, what the key buckets of risks are, and then break those down into more subsidiary buckets, if you will. So you can see with the environment, maybe the internal environment, the external environment, the political environment. In sales, you might have a competitive environment. You might have an international environment. Under environment, it might be something, even be the weather environment, right? We can't get it dry enough to pour the darn concrete, so we're behind. So that's an example of a risk breakdown structure of how you have the main buckets and then each of the subsidiary ones. And you break them down until it makes sense. Like, for instance, if we look in technical and you see requirements, you could have a bucket of another breakdown that says stability. You could have another one that says clarity. You could say another one that has completeness. So then you could look to say, okay, what in my requirements, are there any requirements I see that are not stable? Or any requirements I think are unclear? And then those start to identify your individual risks. So again, break it down to whatever level makes sense for your project and have these categories of risk, whatever makes sense for your individual project. And again, this is just a tool to help you define individual risks that will happen later. Did somebody have a question? Okay. All right. Next slide. Okay, good. All right, so that's the risk breakdown structure. That's one part of your homework. I think many of you did okay on that. Some of you had some questions, so hopefully that clarifies the risk breakdown structure. Now I want to move into defining or assessing probability and impact. And before before we go into that, I need to hit two key points. When you're looking at probability, you're not saying what's the likelihood that this event will cause a cost overrun. That's not what you're saying. And you're not saying what's the likelihood that this event will cause a schedule overrun. What you're saying is, what's the likelihood that this thing could happen? Period. What's the likelihood that this thing will happen? Oh, 80% chance or 40% chance or a high probability it'll happen. You're just looking at the event, not the impact or consequence of any event happening, just what's the likelihood it'll happen. Then, when you're looking at the impact of an event, the way you want to do it is assuming this event does happen. In other words, assuming the probability is 100%. This event happens. Now, what's the impact on my budget now that the event has happened? What's the impact on my schedule, my stakeholder satisfaction, my scope? So that's how you kind of frame these questions is, what's the likelihood it could happen? Assuming it happens, what's the impact of these objectives? Okay, next slide. So these are some sample definitions of probability, and many of you use this band, and it's a very common band. It just, you know, if it's in 5 categories, you just have an even 20% in each category. Nothing wrong with it. It's totally fine. Notice I say that the event will occur, right? Just that it'll happen. There are other ways to do this that reflect risk appetite. So if somebody was more risk averse, you might have a very low probability as 1 to 5%, and a low probability is 5 to 15, and a medium is 15 to 25, high 25 to 35, and very high might be I'm very risk averse, and anything greater than 35% I'm going to say is very high probability. So that indicates somebody who is very uncomfortable with uncertainty. So you can use these definitions of probability, or when we get into impact, to reflect your risk appetite. Okay? So however you want to do this on what you're turning in is fine. Many of you have done the 1 to 20, 20 to 40, and so on, and that's totally great. All right, so now we're going to go to the next slide and look at definitions of impact. So for cost, now let's look at cost. So notice that I said overrun of a control account budget of less than 5%. So if you remember, a control account is a discrete deliverable. It's where I collect cost and schedule information. So you could say, if you don't want to say control account, you could say overrun of a budget line item, or overrun of a cost estimate of between 0 and 5%. I use control account. It's a common way to look at things in project management. But if you want to say overrun of an estimate by 5%, overrun of an estimate 5 to 10%. The reason, so what I want to caution you about is don't do it at 5% of the total budget, or 5 to 10% of the total budget. Because remember, you're going to be looking at many, many different risks. What if you have a budget of $1 million? And if you say, hey, anything less than 5% of the total budget is a low risk, 5% of that is $50,000. And if you get 5 things that go over $50,000, all of a sudden it's $250,000 over budget. No, that's not pocket change. So you need to be very crystal clear when you're speaking about at what level of the project are you talking about your overrun. So here we're saying a control account or a deliverable. Okay? So, and here we've got a rating of 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, greater than 20. Again, you can make these bands larger if you're more, you have a greater risk appetite or a greater risk tolerance, or they'd be tighter if you had a very tight fixed budget. The the same thing would happen if you're talking about schedule. So let me give you some examples for schedule. Remember that every single overrun on schedule, they're additive. So what you want, there's a couple things on schedule. The first thing is you want to look at schedule, like, is it on the critical path? So maybe a very low impact on schedule would be uses some float for an activity not on the critical path. And low might be uses all the float for an activity not on a critical path. Medium schedule risk might be goes over the schedule, the estimated duration of an activity on the critical path by 10%. Or you could say by 3 days. And then high might be by a week, and very high might be of greater than a week, right? So think about the additive impact of multiple activities going over schedule. And you don't want to say of the entire schedule, right, going 10% over my entire schedule, because if you have a 9-month schedule, that's 270 days. You don't want to be a month late. You're out of your growing season then, right? So you got to think about something that's on the critical path. And so for us, it's the farm school and it's the pea patches in the growing season. So you want to think about that. So anything that's on the critical path or has a constrained schedule, anything that's going to impact that by more than a week is probably a very high impact on schedule, because we can't have too many of those or the whole thing's blown. Okay, and then when you're talking about scope or quality, rather than say a specific thing like a low impact is an impact to the dog park, whereas a medium impact is an impact to the public areas, and a very high impact is the farm school, don't look at it at individual deliverables. I want you to think about it globally. So for very low impact would be any impact to the scope that caused it was almost unnoticeable degradation. Okay, and then low might be a difference in requirements, but it was an acceptable variance for a requirement. And then medium might be there was a significant portion of a deliverable that was different from the requirements. High might be the deliverable was mostly not usable, and then very high would be the deliverable is essentially useless. It does not function at all, right? So that's the way I kind of think you should look at scope. Keep it general enough so it could apply to any scope, whether it's the farm school, whether it's the pea patches, whether it's the funding stream, well, not the funding stream, but the parking lot or the community meeting center, whatever it is, it has to be general enough that it can apply to anything. And then most of you are doing pretty good at stakeholder satisfaction. It's like, 90% of the stakeholders are aligned, or 50% of the community is participating, or something like that. So each of the impact definitions relates to an objective, but you can't just say 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. You literally got to think about what you're doing, and you do your thinking up front when you're making your risk management plan, so that when you're identifying and evaluating risks like you will be this week, you've already done your thinking about what constitutes a high, medium, or low impact, high, medium, or low, or very high or very low probability. Okay, so that's the definitions of those. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so now this is a probability and impact matrix. And so you'll notice, like in the lower left-hand corner, you've got a very low probability of something that will occur and a very low impact if it does. Most of that stuff that's very low, or very low, low, we're going to consider those fine. We're going to accept those. We aren't going to worry about them. And the majority of your risks will be there. It's the ones that are very high impact and very, very high probability that we want to pay attention to. But we're not going to know that until we go through the rigor of identifying and evaluating the probability and evaluating the impact of every single objective. So we're going to map the individual risk events using the definitions that we just developed. Next page. All right. So another way of being able to work with risk is to turn our, if you will, qualitative assessment, very low, low, medium, high, and very high, into a quantitative or a measurable scheme. And one of the ways we do that is just say very low equals 1, low is 2, medium is 3, high is 4, very high is 5. And so you can see a very high, very high. The highest score you could get would be 25. Very low is 1. So in this way, you could say any risk that is 4 or below, I'm going to consider to be a low risk. Anything that is between 5 and 10 is a medium risk, and anything greater than 10 is a high risk. So I can quantitatively draw my lines of demarcation or my lines in the sand of what is considered a medium risk or a high risk based on a numeric structure. So that's the usefulness of doing this. Now, there's something else I want to say, that you can also use this numbering pattern to also reflect your risk appetite. So here's what I'll say. If you are struggling to keep up with the concepts thus far, I want you to just check out for a minute, because I'm going to make it a little bit more complicated, and you don't have to know this for this class. But if you're like, yeah, I got this and I dig it, I love the way we're quantifying all this uncertainty, then here's another wrinkle for you. And that is, what if I had a very balanced, or what I would call neutral, risk appetite for something on scope? Like, for instance, with scope, it's like, hey, you know, low, low is great. It's low risk, and, you know, very high is a high risk. That's fine. Everything's good. So it's kind of balanced. But what if I was looking at schedule, and I'm very risk averse on schedule? I might number this differently. So instead of having my impact go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for high, maybe I would say very low is 1, low is 2, medium is 4, high is 8, and very high is 10. So I'm doubling everything up until I get to very high. Or I could say very low is 0.5, then low is 2, 4, 8, right? Or I could do it 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So the impacts are weighted more heavily than the probability. And that pops your numbers up. So those things are going to go to the top. Any risk that has a schedule risk associated with it will have a higher score automatically, and that will draw your eye to it when you're sorting. If you're sorting by the highest number, that will pull those risks that have a schedule risk to the top of your list. So my point is that you can use the way you design your quantitative tables to reflect your risk appetite. Okay? I'm not going to go into it any deeper than that. It's complicated enough as it is, but I just wanted to say that, you know, numbers are models. The whole concept of numbers is developing a model that reflects reality. That's this whole thing about risk. Risk deals with uncertainty, and what you want is you want to develop a numeric model that accurately reflects your risk appetite to the uncertainty. I know, I just threw just a whole bunch of risk jargon at you, and I'm very sorry about that, but that's what we're doing with risk management. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so this way of showing the red, yellow, and green on this probability and impact matrix shows a balanced or a neutral risk appetite. In other words, I've got 6 boxes that are green, 6 boxes that are red, and the rest is yellow. So I'm pretty balanced here. I'm not risk averse. I'm not a risk taker. It's pretty much by the book, by the numbers. So now we'll look at this next slide. And this one shows I'm very risk averse on whichever particular objective this is. So I've only got 4 boxes that are low risk, and I've got 12 boxes that are red risk. So I'm very risk averse here. And just the way I differentiated on the combination of probability and impact that indicates that something is a high risk versus a medium risk versus a low risk reflects my risk appetite, reflects the amount of uncertainty that I'm willing to tolerate on a particular objective. Another way of saying that is I have a lower threshold for action, right? Because we talked about thresholds that reflect your risk appetite. So I have a lower threshold of where I need to take action. So on this one, any probability of high probability and low probability, high impact, says that's a high risk. Even if it's a low probability that I could have a high impact, I'm considering it a high risk because I can't let something happen there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so that's mostly, well, that covers everything that was on the homework. So I think I gave you a really robust description on how you would set up your definitions of probability, your definitions of impact by objective, and how you would combine them into a probability and impact matrix for each objective so that they reflected your risk tolerance or your risk appetite for each objective. And so now I'll just quickly cover the rest of the slides. In your risk management plan, you also talk about risk management funding. And there's funding such as, what if you have a risk that you need to find out more about, like maybe overall risk associated with weather patterns or something. You want to say, okay, how many years do we go over the floodplain on this? Or, what's the 100-year storm or the 20-year storm? What's the floodplain going to look like? And you might need some expert advice. You're going to have to pay a meteorologist or a geologist or something like that. So funding for that to avoid or understand your risk comes from risk management funding. Funding to mitigate or reduce the probability or impact of a risk comes from risk management funding. Transferring risk to a contractor, somebody else to manage the risk. Contingency plans or backup plans comes from risk management funding. And then allocating reserve or protection amount is risk management funding. So you got to figure out how much funding you'll need, not only to respond to risk by mitigating, transfer, or avoiding a risk, but also how to find out more and get expert advice on how to do this. Next slide. Okay, so I want to walk through this example on how we'll use the probability and impact matrix. So you did all your ratings for the risk, and now this week you're going to identify risks, and you're going to use those ratings, and you're going to fill out your probability and impact matrix. Now this one, I don't have scope in there. Whatever, brain fade, I didn't put it in there for the example, but in yours you'll have your scope. So here we have this set up where, hey, if a key resource, and in particular I'm thinking about Joe here, is pulled from our project, we'll need to get a contract resource in to replace them. So we may have some background information like Joe is the only one in our organization with that skill set, and by the way, we heard he's applying for another job and he might go. So here we look at the probability and we say, well, I think it's a pretty high probability that something could happen with him. So we're going to look at, what we think, high is 60 to 80%. So we might say, well, we think it's greater than 50%, but it's not quite at 80%. So that's a high probability that it's going to occur. And then we would look through the impact to each objective. Will that impact customer satisfaction? Probably not, because the customer won't know what Joe did. It could impact our cost a little bit because we're going to have to get a resource, and it could impact our schedule because we're going to have to train that resource. So let's go to the next slide. Next. If you hit it again, it'll fill in. There we go, the others. So we say, losing Joe from our project, he's like trained, he knows everything. We'd have to stop, we'd have to contract someone, we'd have to find someone, bring them in and train him, so it would have a very high impact on our schedule. And like I said, cost, we're going to be spending money to replace Joe. Satisfaction, it wouldn't hit that. So the way you develop a risk score is you do probability times your impact. So in this case, 4 times 5 is 20, and probability times the cost impact, 4 times 3 is 12. So you've got a score of 20 plus 12. The total score is 32 on that. And if you hit it one more time, it should show 32. There we go. So once you go through your risk register and you determine your probability and you determine your impact, and then you have your score, if you're running this in an Excel sheet, you can very easily just sort on your score, and your highest risks will bubble up. The ones with the highest score will bubble up. And or you can also plot them on your probability impact matrix. So if you go to the next page, we'll see that. Advance the slide 1.
Sorry, Cyndi. Look up there.
Okay, can you go back one more? I think, no, I guess not. Anyway, you would plot this on your various probability and impact matrices. So for the schedule 1, you'd plot it as a 4 probability, 5 on schedule, and it would show up as a high schedule risk. 4 probability, medium cost, depends on how you shaded it. If cost was a risk averse, it'd probably show up as high. If you are more risk tolerant on cost, it'd probably show up as medium. Okay, so you could also do it that way. And one of the benefits about using those multiple probability impact matrices is you can look for clusters of risks. Like you can say, what are all these risks up here that have a very high probability but a medium impact? What is that? And are they all related? Maybe, they're all sitting in one pocket in your risk breakdown structure, and you can develop a response that can wipe them all out. So it just any different way that you can look at risk, any different lens or any different way that you can slice or dice the data so you have a better understanding of the risk, what we call a risk profile. The risk profile of your project will help you. All right, so I think the next slide is the last one that just talks about the assignment. Yep, so that's it. That's it. So again, you're not identifying individual risks for your risk management plan, but this week you will be identifying risks. I think I've given you a lot of information. I'm sorry that it was confusing for you and that I did not fill in enough information. I'll make sure that in the future I have a recorded something or other like this to help you with. So if you're listening to this and you haven't done your risk management plan yet, normally I would give you another 48 hours, so I would give you till Wednesday, but in fact I won't be looking at these because your Wednesday night is going to be my Thursday morning and I won't be back till Thursday night. So turn it in by Thursday night and I will look at it. I will not consider it late. I know a lot of you were struggling with this. I just want you to get the concepts and the information. If you're still struggling, email me and let me know what specifically you're struggling with. Try and dig into it enough so you can describe the area of uncertainty and you can describe the specific problems you're having. And if you can figure out how to describe the problem, I can probably figure out how to answer it for you. I think that the information I've given you on this webinar should help clarify things. Again, if you need more help, just email me. I will respond as quickly as I can. So thank you for taking the time to listen to the webinar and get further clarification on this. I appreciate your stickiness and your dogged commitment to getting this assignment right. So that's all we've got. And cut it off now, Paula.